the subject today is Ann Marbury Hutchinson, who was founding mother or American Jezebel. 375 years ago, a 46-year-old woman named Ann Marbury Hutchinson arrived here in Portsmouth on foot, having walked for a week in thigh-deep snow from Boston, where she and her large family had lived for 4 years. She was accompanied on the trip by many of her children and about 30 friends and supporters, and she was pregnant with what she hoped would be her 16th child. Why did she come? The November before, the colony of Massachusetts had banished her for presuming to teach men rather than women, which was permissible, about the Bible. She had spent the winter imprisoned in a minister's brother's house in Roxbury, Mass, under house arrest, apart from her family, who were in downtown Boston. And in March, the First Church of Boston, of which she was a member, had put her on trial and cast her out, calling her an ally of Satan. Over the winter, knowing they had to abandon Massachusetts and find a new home, she and her husband had looked north to New Hampshire and south to find a new home, and deciding on this area, I think because it would have been a little bit warmer and pleasanter, her husband, elder sons, and several male supporters sailed from Boston to this island, just south of the Reverend Roger Williams's Providence plantation. He was another Massachusetts outcast, and he helped the Hutchinson group negotiate the sale of this island from the Narragansett. And 2 decades after this, when this settlement merged with Williams's to form the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, Ann Hutchinson became the only woman ever to co-found an American colony. Who was this remarkable founding mother? She was a child of Elizabethan England and of Shakespearean London. Born in Lincolnshire, England in 1591, she spent her teen years in a vicarage across the Thames River from the Globe Theatre, so Shakespeare would have walked by her house on his way to and from his theatre on the steamy south side of the river, where no self-respecting Puritan like the Marbury family would ever want to go. Her father was the Reverend Francis Marbury, a brilliant preacher who had himself been tried and imprisoned by the Church of England. So many of Puritans in this time in England were getting jailed or silenced, or both. It was the Reverend Francis Marbury who gave his daughter Anne a defiant self-confidence and the gift of explaining Scripture. From her mother, Bridget Dryden, a midwife and aunt of the poet laureate John Dryden, Anne learned midwifery. At the age of 21, she married a wealthy merchant from her hometown and returned to Lincolnshire, where she raised their large family and taught Puritan theology to other women at home. Over the next 20 years, Ann Hutchinson collaborated with the celebrated Puritan minister John Cotton, who you see on the left. He was the equivalent in Puritan England of, I guess, Jay-Z or maybe Mick Jagger here in the 1960s. He was the superstar of Puritan England. And he felt, John Cotton there, felt that Ann Hutchinson was better than any minister at preparing souls for him to convert, which was rather a remarkable thing given that she was a woman. But in 1633, after Cotton, also, like so many other prominent Puritans, was silenced by the Church of England, he sailed to Boston in Massachusetts. You see London here, and Boston in England is there on the east coast. And the little village where Ann Hutchinson lived is there, Alford. So that's in the county of Lincolnshire. And John Cotton preached in Boston when he came. Apparently, the reason they named the city of Boston here, the town of Boston then, Boston was in honor of him because he was the vicar of Boston in England. So they wanted him to feel at home. They were desperate for him to come to Puritan Boston here. Well, she was very upset that he left. And she soon followed him. A year later, 12 of her children and her husband, William, and she sailed to this Boston. And by 1636, she was lecturing weekly to audiences of as many as 80 women and men in her Boston parlor. So just to give you a sense here, you see Boston back then only had, was just this tiny little peninsula, Shawmut Peninsula, about a mile square, sticking out into Boston Harbor, and all of this land around it has been added in, like Fenway Park is about there. So you see, that was all marsh all along there. It's all been filled in. But Boston was this tiny little peninsula. And in her home, she was interpreting scriptures before a growing audience of women and eventually men, as I said. What she was doing in her lectures was explaining the scripture and also questioning the judgment and the preaching of many of the local Massachusetts ministers, which was a problem. And it was a period of time in history, in American history, when a woman could not legally teach men or teach anyone outside her own home. And here she was, attracting a following of prominent citizens eager for reform, including a young Englishman named Henry Vane, who defeated the colonial founder, John Winthrop, in the race for governor that year. And it started to seem to Winthrop that Ann Hutchinson had the strongest constituency in Massachusetts. As one minister said, she has stepped out of her place. She has rather been a husband than a wife, a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate or judge than a subject. And I can just give you a little sense from this map of Boston at the time of where everybody was. This is the center of Boston here, downtown Boston. That's the north end. And so you see Ann's house, Winthrop's house right across the road, but John Cotton, the minister's house, and everything is very close. And the meeting house is number one. So that's sort of the center of the community. That would have been not only the church for the community, but also it's basically town hall and court. Everything went on there. Threatened by her growing power, John Winthrop and a group of powerful ministers set out to remove her. If it had been a little bit later and they hadn't been so worried about losing their colonial charter, the royal charter that gave them the right to all this land, they probably would have hanged her as a witch. But they were scared of losing that charter, and they didn't want to upset the king in England. So they called her in 1637 before the court on a charge of heresy. Now, she defended herself brilliantly, but they were basically throwing back and forth biblical references. But the court, faced with the perceived threat to public order, banished her for behaving in a manner not fitting for her sex. It was Winthrop's belief that she used her devilish powers to subjugate men by establishing the wicked community of women, which he meant when he said that, he meant a community in which women and men are equal, which he thought would lead to widespread adultery. He called her a woman not fit for our society, and referring to the ancient Israeli queen widely recognized as the most evil woman in the Bible, this American Jezebel. In the book of Revelation, God accuses his followers of allowing that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. I will kill her children with death. The actual Jezebel, written about in the Old Testament, lived more than 8 centuries before the Christian era. She was a Phoenician princess, daughter of a high priest and a king of the Sidonians in Tyre, in modern-day Lebanon. She worshipped the ancient Canaanite gods. To the Hebrews, whose God had no face or image, the Phoenician gods, such as Baal, were pagan idols. As a young woman, Jezebel married Ahab, a Jew who became king of Israel in 874 BC. In this mixed marriage, Ahab worshipped the Hebrew god Yahweh, while Jezebel worshiped the Phoenician gods. To please his wife, according to the Old Testament, Ahab built a temple and an altar to Baal on the Jordan River. This angered God, as recounted in the book of Kings. The army of Israel, soldiers and chariots, charged toward Jezebel's palace, threw her from the window and trampled her body. Then they slaughtered her and Ahab's 70 sons, fulfilling the prophecy that the Lord would take vengeance on Jezebel's poisoned seed. Like Winthrop's account of Ann Hutchinson, which he sent back to England after the trials, the Hebrew Bible is an Orthodox history, a history written by the winners. Just as Hutchinson was to Winthrop the subtlety of Satan, so too Queen Jezebel was a false prophet to the authors of the Hebrew Bible. Today, though, Hutchinson is widely honored as co-founder of an American colony, as well as midwife to the nation's first college. Just 1 week after banishing Ann Hutchinson, the Massachusetts court ordered the building of Harvard College to enforce religious orthodoxy and prevent a charismatic radical like her from ever again holding sway in Massachusetts. The late chaplain of Harvard, Peter Gomes, has said that Harvard was erected to prevent future seditious Miss Hutchinsons. She is also one of the early Americans whose commitment to independent judgment inspired the religious freedom clauses in the Charter of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, and ultimately the 1789 Constitution of the United States. Her belief in the ability of the individual conscience to look inward to determine what is true underlies our modern concepts of religious tolerance and individual liberties. What did Ann Hutchinson look like? These are two standard portraits by people who really had no idea what she looked like. On the left is a drawing I think of as just a standard Puritan woman. I think that was done in the 19th century. And on the right is a statue of her and her daughter Susan. And she's looking to heaven. That's a sculpture in front of the Mass State House. And we really have no idea what she looked like. The reason is there are no portraits of any women in colonial New England. We have portraits of men like Cotton and Winthrop, but no women. We do know something about what she would have looked like, though, because John Winthrop wrote voluminously in his private journals, like any good Puritan man. And if she were horribly ugly, he would have told us, because he did. And if she were beautiful or comely in his language, he would have said that as well. So we know she was ordinary looking, average, nothing to particularly comment on. When my biography of Ann Hutchinson was published, we had to come up with a cover. This was one of the draft covers that the publisher came up with. And I mean, it's a nice portrait of a 17th century woman, European background. And we rejected that. Any guesses as to why? Does she look like she could walk from Boston to Rhode Island? So this is what we ended up with. It's a portrait of a painter in Holland around 1630. A woman, a self-portrait by a Dutch Puritan. And interestingly, this painter, I actually can't think of her last name. Her first name is Judith, but she was a great portrait painter in Holland in the 1620s, and she married right around that time, and her husband was also a painter, and her work stopped right when she married him, and the quality of his work went up, and he became a very celebrated Dutch artist. So it's perhaps an appropriate portrait, and we used only a bit of it, just to let her eyes look out, because it isn't Ann Hutchinson, and we really don't know what she looked like. Now I want to consider where she would have lived here in Portsmouth. Most of the land that her family occupied for 4 years here on the western shore of the Great Cove is now underwater because the coastline has changed somewhat. But in the 1960s, a local man walking his dog on the beach on the Great Cove found early 17th century English clay pipes, Delft-ware pottery, and animal bones. So, I assume you're all familiar with the Great Cove. At his urging, a few years later, two prominent university archaeologists spent 2 summers here excavating the midden into which Ann Hutchinson and her family threw their garbage in the late 1630s. These middens are the great architectural gems that we've discovered in recent years under the Big Dig in Boston, are wonderful garbage piles dating back to the 1640s, 50s, and 60s that make for wonderful exhibitions. And this was Portsmouth's midden, in which the archaeologists found clay pottery that came from early 17th century England and Germany, nails, spoons, thimbles, and many clay pipes that were made in Bristol in England before 1640. They've all been dated, and they were on display for some time at the local Portsmouth Library. Well, about 10 years ago, when I came here to research my biography of Ann Hutchinson, I went to talk to the man who had discovered the midden site while walking his dog. Oh wait, I guess I need to go through these. This is actually a picture of, from the highway, looking into the Great Cove, and basically right in the center is the spot where he was walking. This is the gentleman I was talking about. John Pierce, retired police chief of Portsmouth, now has died, was very friendly to me, and he offered me a tour of the site, but we couldn't get there, actually, because there was a tidal estuary. You could only walk there at low tide. So he drew me a map on a napkin of how to reach the site by water, which I did with my daughters the next day. This shows him unable to get through the brambles to the site. So we rented a kayak in Tiverton. It's about a 30-minute kayak ride if you'd like to do it. It's a very nice ride. Under the Mount Hope Bridge, paddling west across the Seconic River into the cove, north of Spectacle Island, aim for the Bristol Bridge, cut through the path beside the boat ramp, head for the cement plant beside Route 24, past the opening in the stone bridge in the water that the archaeologists created in 1971, and turn into the isolated beach, backed by a low dune that was owned by Will Hutchinson and his sons and sons-in-law in 1638. And that's the beach itself, where the excavation was carried out and where they would have lived. After we found it, I went to thank Mr. Pierce for his help, and he pointed out to me in our chat that Ann Hutchinson's name is not on any of the documents from the founding of Rhode Island. Indeed, the signers of the Portsmouth Compact were 20 Englishmen from Boston, who include, that's the Portsmouth Compact on the right, and that's my children 10 years ago over the brass compact in Founders Memorial Park. There are 20 Englishmen from Boston who included Ann's husband, several sons and sons-in-law, and her strongest male supporters from Boston who came with her voluntarily. After purchasing this land from the Indians, these men agreed jointly to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience, unawed by the civil power which had caused them so many problems in Boston. Well, Ann Hutchinson's name wasn't present on the compact, you see there, because women in early America couldn't sign land deeds or any legal documents. In fact, female names appear in the paper record only at birth, marriage, and death. It's almost as if women didn't exist on the paper record of 17th century America. And the only reason we today know anything about what Ann Hutchinson thought or believed is that she so irked the founders of Massachusetts that they recorded her every word spoken at her 2 trials, the civil trial and the church trial, just before she came here. During most of her life, Ann Hutchinson was present as an absence. As soon as the men of power in Boston learned of her teaching, they brought her to court to stop her, or failing that, to remove her. Her power was by definition private, outside the public sphere. As a woman of power, she was a Jezebel, a woman who had to be cast out. And even now, with female suffrage and equal rights, the absence remains. In nearly 4 centuries of history, not one recognized founder or president of the United States is a woman. Women serve as a minority on the highest court, Congress, and the president's cabinet, but they remain outcasts at the country's highest office. Today, for the first time ever, 20% of Congress is female. Maybe that's why it remains so unpopular. There remains truth in John Winthrop's observation to Ann Hutchinson that public power is not tolerable or fitting for your sex. Well, the story of Ann Hutchinson does not end in Rhode Island. In 1642, after 4 years here, during which her husband William died, I think of exhaustion from these multiple migrations his family had made, she petitioned the Dutch authorities in New Amsterdam, who were more tolerant of religious dissent than the English, for permission to build a house in what is now the North Bronx. She was welcomed in New Amsterdam. She was now a 52-year-old widow and 7 of her younger children, and a few sons-in-law. In July of 1643, during an ongoing conflict between the Dutch and the Siwanoy Indians, her Dutch neighbors warned her to abandon her farmhouse in anticipation of an Indian raid. They would go back and forth, but they would have the courtesy to warn each other before each side came through and burned the settlement of the other. Well, Hutchinson had opposed all English efforts to suppress Native Americans, and she refused to leave her house or bear arms. The Siwanoy warriors were surprised to find any European settlers present when they came in. They scalped her and her daughters, sons, and sons-in-law, and burned their bodies inside their dwelling. Despite this massacre, 5 of her older children, who still lived in New England with their families, and her 9-year-old daughter, Susan, who was out picking berries during the rampage, survived the matriarch. So she had more than 30 grandchildren, which is why she's, another reason she's considered a founding mother. She's at the basis of the Mormon efforts to find the genealogy of everyone in America, because she has so many known descendants. When the Siwanoy discovered the 9-year-old Susan, or Susanna, which some people here call her, they found her hiding between the halves of the split rock, which is pictured there, and they adopted her, which was very common, that English girls and women would be adopted by the natives and move to live among the natives, and many of them, when they had the chance to come back into English society, chose not to. Although Susanna did come back, and she married an Englishman in Boston, and she settled in Rhode Island, and lived a long life and raised a large family here. And the chief of the Siwanoy, who realized at this point who he had killed, renamed himself after Ann Hutchinson. He called himself Ann Hoke. And the nearby river was given her surname, and so the modern Hutchinson River Parkway, which was visible there in the image. In this image of the bridge, of the rock, and also in the map. While researching my biography, American Jezebel, I went to the Northern Bronx to see where she spent that last year of her life before she died. There obviously are no remains of her farmhouse, which was burned. But the character of the area is well preserved because it's part of New York City's largest public park, Pelham Bay Park. Very beautiful place with miles of trails meandering through protected saltwater marsh and forest. To get a closer look at the split rock, which you drive by at 70 miles an hour at the juncture of the Hutchinson River Parkway and the New England Thruway, I asked at the Pelham Bay Split Rock Golf Course for directions. Nobody knew how to get there. Someone said I should ask at a local stable. And when I went there was a young woman standing out in front named Leslie, who didn't know anything about getting to the rock. And she said there was no map at the stable, but there was an old blacksmith there who might know because he'd ridden for decades in this area. And she went and asked him and came back to me and knew how to get there. And she said, why don't I just saddle you up a horse and take you there? So I actually got to go see the split rock on horseback, which was extremely unexpected. My 4 kids and husband were in the car, It was, I had to pretend that I knew how to ride. But anyway, it's a nice ride, about a mile along the bridle path, if you ever want to try that. And it shows you that researching and writing history is not all hard work. I just wanted to mention a few of the sort of interesting facts about Ann's life. Her cousin was John Dryden, the poet laureate. She had two of her older daughters, before she immigrated, had died of the plague in England. She walked here, I told you before. She was 46 and pregnant for the 16th time. 12 of her children survived childhood, which is a remarkable record. She had 15 births, and it was a infant mortality rate of 50% at the time. So she was revered in the community as a brilliant mother and supporter of other women and helping them give birth as well, at a time when it was extremely risky. Many women died in or after childbirth, and half of their children were dead within a few years. And as I said, she had more than 30 grandchildren, and her descendants include both Presidents Bush and FDR. And I just wanted to give you a couple of her own quotes. I said we don't have any papers, we don't have any portraits, we don't have any of her writings, which we of course have loads of those things of the male leaders of her community. But we have her trial transcripts. And she said to the court of Massachusetts during her civil trial, this is a very characteristic Ann Hutchinson quote, "Do you think it not lawful for me to teach women," which of course the Bible admonishes a good Puritan to do, "and why do you call me to teach the court?" She said that to Governor John Winthrop. Then at the end of her church trial, she said to her followers, she had already walked out of the church, outcast, and she said, "Better to be cast out of the church than to deny Jesus Christ." And the third quote, which I think is perhaps the most characteristic Ann Hutchinson quote, in terms of her legacy, "I will give you the ground of what I know to be true." This is what she said to the court of Massachusetts, that she believed she could read the Bible, she could try to understand it, and she had the right to say what she believed it meant, which her society in Massachusetts did not accept. She was welcomed here in Rhode Island and in New York. Ultimately, Ann Hutchinson was both founding mother and American Jezebel. Indeed, she embodies many traits that seem contradictory, both heresy and piety, both femininity and political power, both reactionary and radical tendencies, like so many of our founders. She serves as a vessel for our imaginations. In a world without religious freedom, civil rights, or free speech, the colonial world that was the seed of the United States, she was a pioneer and visionary who epitomized the religious freedom and tolerance that are essential to America's character. Her story raises issues that remain relevant to us 4 centuries later, such as gender equality, freedom of conscience, and the right to free speech. Her bold engagement in religious, political, and moral conflict early in our history helped shape the way we Americans see ourselves today. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to have questions and discussion.